Bienvenidos, bienvenidos, welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you today with us. This is the Vision Zero Challenge webinar series. Today we are going to talk about speed management in your cities. And it's with great pleasure that I want to introduce my dear colleague Adriana Lobo. She's the director of the WRI offices in Mexico and Colombia, and she will give us the welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I think this is the day that the people who are working in mobility, we can feel a little bit like heroes, because talking about Vision Zero is really talking about saving lives. And there is so much to do in our countries and in our cities to be able to have really zero deaths by accident. From our work, there is one small anecdote that I would like to share. Just like a couple of years ago, we were starting some work in the city of Colima in Mexico. That is where you can see some of the pictures with really changing the landscape of the city. But the first conversation with the officials was that the main avenue, the main highway around the city, the ring bell, had people used it to run at 120 kilometers per hour, which is 75 miles per hour. And when we said, this is a very bad speed, the guy said, no, we have the human right to speed how much we want. So starting from that, we know that in many places, there is a lot of conscious that speed is a bad thing for health. It's that we cannot speed like this if we really want to take care of life. But we also know that many of the cities are not yet there. And people that are really involved in taking decisions in our cities still have a lot to learn. I know there is cities that are very advanced and have been working for a long time. And this is what we want to share the word so that we do not have any more casualties. And speed is one of the main drivers of this very unfortunate losses that we have almost every day in our countries. So I think this is going to be a very important webinar. I hope we can learn a lot together. And I know this is very courageous. Everybody who has taken any action to moderate speed in our city has initially, I think, found some resistance, just to know by sure at the end that is all worth, and that the mobility in the city is actually improved, and we can have much better results. So it's going to be a very significant webinar with a lot of experiences, with a lot of data, so that we can together orient action for a better future for all. Thank you very, very much. I would like just to move forward and introduce our panelists today. Actually, I'll just end today's agenda first. We are going to have one very significant presentation from Blair, busting myths and about speed management. And this is an issue that has a lot of myths around it. Then we will have a poll where you can really answer and give your opinion. And then a guided discussion with audience questions for our experts. And then we have an incredible group of people, which I'm going to have the chance to introduce in just a minute. And finally, our closing remarks from Claudia Driozola, who is our Health and Road Safety Director. So next, please. We really welcome the Vision Zero cities. These cities working together, I'm sure, are going to make a very big difference in Latin America, so that we have much healthier cities and we can keep the lives of many of our beloved people, especially the young people who are so vulnerable to speed. So thank you to all of you for participating and joining, but especially thank you for any action that you do to control speed and to make your cities better places to live. Next one, please. We also have a very significant number of partners who are collaborating with Vision Zero. And we have to acknowledge that the only way to have such significant change is working in partnerships. So we are very glad that we have this incredible number of partners working together. and having an alliance for Vision Zero. And the next one, and finally, to really thank our sponsors. Without the sponsors, we couldn't make this webinar happen. So 3M, PTV, Volvo Group, thank you very much for supporting this initiative and for caring about the lives of people. Thank you very much. So please use the chat so that you can submit your questions. We will be at the end. There are people in our team that are paying really attention to your questions, to your comments. And next one. And now I will have the pleasure to introduce our guests. Actually, I will just say their name, who they are, and they will have the chance just to say hi and to talk a little bit 30, 40 seconds about who they are and what they are doing now in terms of Vision Zero. Next one, please. So the first one is Blair Turner. He's the Senior Transport Specialist from the World Bank Global Road Safety Facility. Please, Blair.
Thank you, Adriana, and welcome everybody. This is a really important topic to be talking about. So great to have everyone along. So I've been involved in speed management for about 25 years, firstly working in government, setting speed limits and developing policy. But for the last 15 years or so, I've been mainly involved in research on speed, ways to effectively manage speeds, different interventions that work. I've just recently moved to the Global Road Safety Facility at the World Bank, where speed is one of our major areas of interest. We know it's one of the major ways we can actually improve road safety to better manage speeds. And what I would say is we're working very hard on this topic across many countries. We're also developing a new speed management hub, a web-based platform. And part of that will be the development of a new global guide on speed management that we're working on right now with WRI. And that'll be released next year. But it will give us some good guidance around how to improve speed and road safety more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. Wonderful experience. We are eager to hear from you. Now I'm going to introduce Iman Abubakar. She is the Urban Mobility Project Manager from WRI in Ethiopia, doing also a wonderful job. Please, Iman, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you everyone for joining this exciting discussion on speed management. So as Audrey said, I'm the Urban Mobility Project Manager for WRI, and I'm based in the regional office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and working on urban mobility and road safety issues across the region. Specifically, my work has really been supporting the Ministry of Transport in Ethiopia, as well as the Addis Ababa Traffic Management Agency on speed management. And WRI has been a really strong partner in helping Addis Ababa design their speed management plan, working side by side with them to implement speed reduction infrastructure and interventions, and really scaling this to a national level. So it's great to be here and great to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. It's a real pleasure in such incredible work that's going on in Addis. Very proud of the work there. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Robbie Hutchinson. She's the Director of Public Works in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are this morning. I'm very pleased to be here and I appreciate the invitation from WRI. I'm Robin Hutchison. I am the Director of Public Works for the city of Minneapolis. I've been working in city government for about 10 years. And before this position, I was in Salt Lake City, Utah. Before that, I was a consultant with some experience in living and working in Europe, which has very much shaped my view. And I know that we learn more from each other when we share information across borders. So I'm very, very happy to have been invited here. One of the first things that I set out to do when I arrived here in the city of Minneapolis about 4 years ago is to bring Vision Zero to a city that I know would benefit from eliminating death and serious injury on our streets. My experience in implementing that has brought me in touch with technical experts on speed, on policy experts, on legislative efforts. And I'm happy to share our experience in Minneapolis. And hopefully there are some things that we've done as a city that you will be able to use and take back to wherever you are. Thanks.
Hi, Robin. It's such a tough negotiation, right?
Yes.
There is a lot of people involved, and not everybody so happy at the beginning of saving lives instead of speeding up. So this is always a challenge.
Not always so happy, but with persistence, we can win them over.
I know, that's the good thing. Thank you very much, Robin. Very eager to hear from you. And now we have Ellen Thompson, who is the Policy Director at the European Transport Safety Council from Belgium. And hi, welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation this afternoon. It's afternoon here for me in Brussels. So I've been working on road safety at the European Transport Safety Council for about 15 years. ETSC, we're a non-governmental organization based in Brussels with over 60 members. And I myself, I'm British, German, and also Belgian. So true European. And well, our main task as an organization is to help reduce road death and serious injuries in Europe by 50%. We have a new strategy, 50% by 2030. And the EU has also adopted the Safe System and Vision Zero in their last strategy. As part of my job, I'm also working with the EU institutions, trying to advocate stronger legislation on road safety. And at the moment, we're working on a Commission recommendation on speed. So when I had this invitation, I thought, oh, wow, this is really interesting, very timely, and I hope I can contribute. We also at ETSC prepare reports ranking the different countries on different topics. And we've recently published one on speed and one on urban mobility. So I'll be very happy to talk a bit more about those later. And then lastly, well, maybe just to say, Brussels today has beautiful sunshine. We're in a second lockdown, semi-lockdown, which means less traffic, more pedestrians, more cyclists. And this is all good preparation. Of course, it's terrible in terms of COVID. But in January, Brussels will introduce 30K as a default on pretty much all of its streets apart from the main arteries. So I've got a very personal interest in the whole discussion around 30km/h zones and speed management. Okay, that's it. Thank you again for the introduction, and I look forward to the discussion later on.
Yeah, very interesting and very exciting to be about to be a 30K city. Thanks so much. We are really eager to hear from you and everything that you have been doing. So next one. Next one is Johanna Wohlrath. She's the Executive Secretary of the National Traffic Safety Commission, CONACET, in Chile. Very welcome, Johanna.
Hi, Adriana. How are you? Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Warm welcome to all the Vision Zero cities. I am actually German, but I live in Chile half of my life right now. So I'm working for 10 years at the Road Safety Commission from Chile. And for 1 year now, I'm leading the Road Safety Commission. We adopted the SAFE system and the Vision Zero a few years ago. And today, actually, we are working with a very strong focus on speed management. So really happy to be here to talk about our experience. And especially, we had a law passed a few years ago with the reduction in urban speed limits from 60 to 50. And we're nowadays working very hardly on seeking to pass a legislation in Congress to allow the speed enforcement with cameras. We don't have the speed cameras in Chile yet, so it's our main topic today. So very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Hi, Joanna. Actually, the cameras have been such an issue in Latin America, right? In almost every other country, we have courts saying no to cameras, which is a pity. So I think this is actually a very significant topic for all of us. So thank you very much. We are very eager to listen from your experience too, Johanna. And next one. Now we've introduced our dear Ben Well, who is the Director of Integrated Transport and Innovation at the World Resources Institute. Welcome, Ben. Ben will be the moderator of our sessions. And I just have to say, you just have to keep up, Ben, and you, Blair. You can see this is a topic with a lot of incredible women. So I think caring for life is a thing that women do very well. So keep up, Ben, keep up, Blair, and welcome.
I'm just trying to keep up. It's very, very difficult. I'm happy to try to be keeping up, but thank you, Audrey. Really appreciate it and look forward to moderating. Do you need me to, am I moderating now, or are we handing it over to Blair at this point?
I am handing over to you, and you hand to Blair.
I just like to leave people in awkward silences. That's what I do. So Blair, I think if you want to begin your presentation, and then we will move into a question time with our colleague Alejandro Schwedhelm.
Sure. If we can just bring up that presentation, I can make a start then. Right, so today I want to talk about some of the myths in speed management, and these are really some of the barriers that we see that sometimes prevent us from making the actions or taking the initiatives we'd like to take in speed management. If we could just advance forward, I'll just give a brief definition of what I mean by a myth. And one more slide again. Great. So a myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. So that's what we'll talk about today. And I'll touch on 5 key myths that really have a big impact and hold us back in terms of making progress on this topic. So myth number 1. People sometimes say that speed isn't all that important, or speed isn't a major cause of road crashes. Another variant on this myth is that changing my speed won't have an impact on safety. So I'll address these 2 issues as my first point. We do know that speed has an absolutely massive impact on road safety outcomes. There's a lot of research globally around on this, and a lot of that research says that around about 30% of all road deaths result from speed. But often those studies say that's probably undercounting the true impact. And I personally believe it is higher than 30%. The reason I believe that is when we put in place good speed management, we can get reductions that are far greater than 30%, possibly 50, 60% reductions in deaths and serious injuries. So to me, it is the biggest cause of deaths on the roads, and it is our major challenge in terms of road safety. The second part to this question is around the impact that even small changes in speed can have. And the graph on the right is quite a famous one. It's based on research, the power model of speed. And what this shows is that even very small changes in speed can have a very large impact on the crash outcomes. And on the bottom axis is the change in speed. On the vertical axis is the change in casualties. And there's actually 3 lines on this graph. And you can see the red line is actually the change in deaths. And that is the most sensitive to these changes in speeds. A very small change in speed can have a very large impact on deaths, such that a 2% increase in speed results in around a 10% increase in death. But the good news here is that reductions in speeds have a similar impact. So that very small reduction in average speed on your networks, perhaps a 2% reduction in speed, can result in 10% reductions in fatal crash outcomes. So that's the first key point, is speed. It certainly is a major cause of crashes, and small changes can have a very large impact. Myth number 2. Often we get the impression from our politicians that they've listened to the public and the public want higher speeds. They want to go from one place to another a lot faster. And often the politicians listen to one or two people that have a very loud voice on this issue, but they forget to understand what the population really wants. And there is some evidence around this issue as well, that international surveys, and there's one I've shown on the screen here from Ezra, where they interview people across many countries. And just some of the key findings from that survey are that less than 20% of people find it acceptable to drive faster than the speed limit. And that's even lower in built up areas like our cities. Less than 10% of people believe it's acceptable to drive faster than that speed limit. Another point from that survey is that most people believe that speed is a critical cause of road crashes. Most people understand that link between speed and safety outcomes. But this next point here is, I think, quite important too, and that is that in that survey, 90% of people suggested that traffic rules should be stricter. So the community and the general public do understand the link between risk and the speed changes, and they do want some more firm actions to be undertaken. And I can certainly add to this from my personal experience. We were involved in a speed limit change for a city. The politicians said, no, 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 people don't want that. So what we did is we did a survey of our local population in that city. And we found that when we asked the question about the change in speed, 80% of the population wanted a lower speed. They recognised there was high risk from these high speeds. And so then we used that information to persuade our politicians to make that change. 1 year later, we went back and we asked the population again, what do you think of that change in speed? Are you happy? And 85% of that community were happy with that change in speed. So I guess a point to consider here is if you want to get that community support, do these surveys and ask the local population and use that evidence to help to convince decision makers and politicians around the change in speeds. Next myth. This is a common one. We often hear from people that lower speeds have a negative impact on the economy, or similarly, they might say that there's a negative impact. There'll be a lot slower travel and longer journey times, or that it might be there's a change and make congestion in our cities worse. So this happens a lot, these sorts of comments. And again, this is often a myth. We do know that there are very strong economic benefits from when we improve road safety through speed management. We get reduced cost in terms of the injuries and deaths, and you remember the graph I showed you earlier before, even those small changes in speed can have a very large impact on death and serious injury. But also there's other co-benefits as well, which we need to make people aware of. There's reduced, often fuel costs at lower speeds, certainly reduced emissions and noise, and broader health and societal benefits. So an increased feeling of inclusion by the community, a greater sense of placemaking where people can meet and enjoy the company of other people from their communities. So all of these things have got an economic benefit that typically far outweighs any disbenefit from that change in speed. Particularly on this journey time issue, people often think that when we're lowering the speed limit, it'll mean my trip will take a lot longer. But that again is often not the case. Especially in cities, there's lots of intersections and congestion. And so people are often driving lower than the speed limit anyway. So lowering the speed limit often doesn't increase the journey time by as much as what many people think. And in fact, to the last point around congestion, it's actually the case, as in the image on the right-hand side here from a motorway system, where when we make the traffic slower, sometimes we can actually make the congestion less and our journey times faster. And what happens here is at this lower speed, people drive at a more consistent travel speed. All the vehicles are now traveling at a more similar speed. There's less stop-start traffic, less shock waves from differences in vehicle speeds. And we've actually found from the research that there's actually the ability to reduce journey times from lower speeds. So the argument around negative economic impacts isn't as black and white as people think. There are certainly some very strong economic benefits from reductions to more appropriate speeds. Next slide. Myth number 4, and we just spoke earlier about speed cameras and the problems that pretty much every country and every city in the world has with speed cameras. Often people from The media will say these are just ways to generate money for the government. A very common myth. What we do know from speed camera research, though, is that speed cameras have a very positive impact on road safety outcomes, up to around about a 30% reduction in fatal and serious crash outcomes when these are done properly. What I would say on this, though, is that it's very important to have transparency, to be very, very clear to our politicians and our public about what we're trying to do. And particularly on these issues around how we select the appropriate locations for those speed cameras. When we explain to the public that it's based on risk, on where people will be injured or killed, this is a stronger basis for us to put in place these speed camera systems. Also, where our speed camera funding is being used to make other safety improvements, if we can tell the public about that as well, that also helps in the discussion. And then the third point there is about reliability. We must ensure the reliability of these systems. We need to constantly check the accuracy and to let the public and politicians know that this is occurring as well, to give confidence in these systems. So the last point on this page, community engagement, making sure that people are aware of these different points. Make sure they're aware about the effectiveness, making sure we're being transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing that. So engage with the community on those issues. And my last myth, number 5, is that education and training on their own will solve the problem. So, the idea here is perhaps we'll tell people to slow down, maybe through a radio advert or on television or one sign, and that will change and slow people down for us. Unfortunately, the research that we have seen shows that we need to do more than just tell people about the problem. We need to take some positive action. And it's often the case that we need to support our lower speeds through other mechanisms, through enforcement as an example, but also through infrastructure support. So the example in this photo here will show this quite clearly. This situation here is a typical collector road. It was 60 kilometers per hour, but ahead on this road, there is actually a school, and it's a very dangerous location where children come from the school and cross the road. And so it was decided we wanted to have a lower speed. If we just change the sign at this location, we might find it's very hard to get compliance. Or if we just told people to slow down, it might be hard to get that compliance. So just advance that slide one more. Thanks. If we just do some very simple things, we can actually give the impression of a different road environment. We can show the road users, the motorized road users, that this is a different environment. The road's been narrowed down. There's some traffic humps on that road. So this is really just an illustration of how we can use infrastructure to support our desired speeds. We can put in place very cheaply some line markings, a little bit of paint, maybe a traffic hump, and that actually has a far stronger effect on reducing speeds down to the levels we'd like. And the public are very compliant when these sorts of techniques are used. So just to my last slide, just to wrap up then and make some key points. There are certainly a lot of myths around speed and speed management. These are just 5 of the many different myths that there are around. I would say that there is also, though, a very good evidence base. We can engage with our decision makers using evidence, and that is available to us to do that. Also, I'd say we need to engage with the community. There is very strong support from our community members when we ask them through surveys about what they think about road safety and about the effect of speed on their communities. So use that evidence base, use that community engagement to help us to understand the situation and to convince our decision makers. My last point really is, I mentioned this when I introduced myself, there is a new speed management hub being produced by the Global Road Safety Facility at the World Bank. So keep your eyes open on the website. There'll be announcements about this, but certainly also be aware that we're about to produce with WRI a new global guide on speed management that will cover off on this evidence base and tell you more about this very important issue. So I'll end there. I'll be listening to the rest of the discussions very eagerly and really welcome the discussion from the panel and from those listening to the call. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Blair. That was most interesting, and I think it was a great way to kick off our discussion with the panel. Very thorough. And I think we already have some questions rolling in too for people to think about. So I do ask our folks to see what those might be, but I will ask sort of general questions and then move to more specific questions that the audience is asking. But first, Alejandro, I'd like to introduce my colleague Alejandro, who will conduct a brief 2-question poll. Alejandro?
Yes, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you everybody for being here today. Thanks, Blair, for that very informative presentation. So as Ben mentioned, I'm going to conduct a quick poll, just composed of 2 questions. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Excellent. So moving on to the first question, which looks like we have a couple people already ahead of the game answering this poll. First, I'm gonna ask you to go to www.menti.com, either on your computer or your phone. I added this information in the chat as well and entered that code that was shown to you in the chat in here, 8630656. And you'll enter the questionnaire. You'll be allowed to select as many answers as you want in this first question. Which speed management measures have been implemented in your city? First, you have speed limit reduction, speed limit enforcement, that could be their safety cameras that were mentioned slightly, or police staff efforts. Number 3, low speed zones. And number 4, traffic calming measures. That could be design or signage. And it looks like we have quite a few answers coming in already. I'm going to give this another 2 or 3 minutes or so, allow as many answers as we can. Then once we get a couple more, I'm going to move on to the next question. And if you're already logged in with the code, the next question should come up automatically. Let's give this 1 more minute. We still have a few coming in. Excellent. So it looks like we have a little more answers on speed limit reduction and traffic calming measures. So we're going to move on to the next question. All right. So next and last question, which is the most common challenge you've experienced when seeking to reduce speed in your city? Select 3. You can only select up to 3 answers. And this should be a very good question that will guide us through the panel discussion that could address for more questions about these challenges experienced when trying to reduce speeds in your city. We're gonna give this another minute or 2 just to go over the options quickly. You have first, public concerns about increased congestion and travel time. Number 2, it can be difficult or expensive to enforce. Number 3, political opposition, very common challenge as we can see right now. Number 4, lack of data to determine location and extent of intervention, also a very common problem. Number 5, difficulty determining the right type of speed management intervention. Number 6, legal and regulatory or procedural barriers, which, as we can see, is also a very common hurdle. Great, we have a lot of answers coming in. We're gonna give this just another minute. And we can see a lot of answers on the first one, the third one, and the sixth one. Almost equally. Great, so thank you very much for taking the time to do this. And I'm gonna give the floor to Ben to lead the discussion.
Thanks, Alejandro. And I think this is interesting. What's encouraging is I think in most cities we're seeing actions on speed management, and we're also seeing challenges to that in a variety of forms. So I'm interested to hear about the experiences of our panelists here today. Why don't we start out with Robin Hutchison? Robin, you're leading a city's, I know the Public Works in Minneapolis is actually the transportation department, more or less, among other things, but you're leading basically the transport department for the city, and you've undertaken a Vision Zero action plan. You have citywide reductions in speed that have been implemented recently, and so why don't we just get your perspective on what are the sort of the key things you're doing and what might be challenges and lessons from a place such as Minneapolis. So thank you, Robin.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the question. And thanks for starting with me, because I was noting that on the last slide, there were the majority of, maybe not the majority, but a lot of people said that they have regulatory challenges to achieving what they want to achieve. And that was one of our biggest hurdles and remains a big hurdle for us. And for the hurdle that we've been able to get through, I think having a plan for the city was the way forward. So it started with a Vision Zero approach. It started with the city officially adopting a Vision Zero platform and using data to demonstrate the problem. We did a sizable study that showed exactly what the problem was in our city and how speed was a part of that. And it was that plan that gave us the basis for having the regulatory and legislative conversation. So for a few years, and beginning really once I joined Minneapolis as the Public Works Director, I made a couple runs at the state legislature to gain the ability to set our own speed limits. And without the ability to set our speed limits, our residential streets are set at 30 miles an hour, which we all know, if you're on this call, you know that that's too fast. And we knew that we would not achieve our safety goals without speed management. So the first thing we had to do is ask our state legislature to allow cities to set their own speed limits. After 2 years of trying, on the third year, and as a result of having an adopted policy of the city, the data and a plan, as well as some extremely enlightened and brilliant engineers who testified, we were able to, we won. You know, we were able to set our own speed limits. And it's not over there. We had to do additional study and additional data collection that made it defensible and also replicable for other cities. But we are now, in about 2 weeks' time, we should install our last sign, and we'll be done reducing speed limits in the city of Minneapolis citywide to 25 miles an hour on arterial streets and 20 miles an hour on residential streets. And that's a huge change for us. I won't talk about this now, but if it comes back around to it, I can talk a little bit about the like winning the hearts and minds of people, which really, you know, you got to work pretty hard at that. And I think we're well on our way. But that first hurdle was regulatory and legislative. And our next hurdle is one that many cities are facing, and that is getting the rights and the ability to do automated speed enforcement. We'd like to take the human beings out of it for a whole lot of reasons, not the least of which is a focus on equity here in Minneapolis. So we'd like to get to automated speed enforcement, and that will be our next legislative hurdle. And maybe I can come back another time and talk about success, because I'm hopeful for it. I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear from other panelists on their experiences.
That's great. I really appreciate hearing this perspective on going into the laws and the rules that are preventing these changes from taking place. You have to get that. You need to do anything, including street design changes. So why don't we go up to the national level then? Johanna, from the perspective of Chile, I mean, you're actually doing this on the national level, right? You're changing some how maybe speed limits can be set in cities. So why don't you give us your perspective on that and other general efforts you're doing to enable safer roads from speed?
Thank you, Ben. Yes, of course. Well, in Chile, actually the main cause of road deaths is speeding. The excessive and inappropriate speed is the most important factor that contributes today to deaths and injuries in our streets. In fact, speeding is responsible for about 30% of fatal crashes in Chile. So I would like to give some background information. In the year 2002, in Chile, we increased the urban speed limits from 50 to 60. So in the following years, we noted an increase of accidents and deaths. And that's why actually we pursued the initiative of reducing speed limits to 50 again during a long time in Chile. It was one of the main road safety challenges in the last decade, you could say, in Chile, because we first increased the urban speed limits to 60, and we wanted to go back to 50. So what did we do? We actually created a lot of awareness campaigns, a lot of work with the media, with the press. I think one of the most important things we did was showing data. We already talked about it today here. Show the problem in media and creating awareness. Blair told us about some myths. I know all of them. We had a lot of public concerns about increasing travel times and such things. So I think one of the most important things was the communication work. And another important work was, or a very great support was the support from the minister, from the transport minister, doing all the work with the politicians, searching for Congress approval. Very important, of course. We saw it here in the poll that we have sometimes political opposition. So, and I would like to point out the most important element. I think the key element was the community engagement. We had a lot of work together with organizations, federations, associations of road traffic victims, and a very strong cyclist community in Chile with a very strong voice. So this was the key finally to achieve the law to pass. The reduction in speed limit, we achieved it in the year 2018. So very happy about it. But I would like to point out another thing. this speed reduction is just one part of the solution. And today we are, our major finding is that we need more enforcement. Just having a speed reduction in the cities is not solving, unfortunately, the problem. The enforcement must be greater, and not just with police enforcement. We're doing this today, a very important action plan together with the Chilean police. But I also already mentioned that we really need today the automatic enforcement, the speed cameras. We had a very bad experience with speed cameras in Chile years ago. We already had the speed cameras, but with a very, very bad execution, you could say. They were not seen as lifesavers, but as kind of boxes to collect money. So this was one of the problems. And today our major challenge is to convince media, to convince politicians, and to convince the community in order to have a speed enforcement by cameras.
Well, it's interesting to get that perspective from the national level and some of the challenge you're dealing with. There's certainly this sense of culture about how people think about safety and their understanding of its role, the role of speed. I'm seeing some questions around that too. So let's even go to a more one more level, to the regional level from the European perspective. Ellen, I was just looking at your website. You were saying in October you had a post about expecting more and more cities to be adopting 30 km/h default speeds. I know you've also been doing a fair number of research and reports on this topic from the ETSC perspective. So if you could give us some of your take on what's happening in Europe and lessons for our friends in Latin America and those beyond that are joining. And before I ask you to answer, I just will say, please put your city in the chat box so we know where you're coming from, because we see people from all over. We'd like to know where you're all coming from. So Ellen, go ahead. Let's hear your perspective.
Sure, thank you. It's so interesting to hear about Minneapolis and Chile as well. So I'll try to give you a bit of news from what's happening in the European Union. And I would say we are definitely going in the right direction in terms of managing speed, reducing speeds in urban areas specifically, but we have a really big challenge, like elsewhere in the world, I'm sure, the challenge of non-compliance with the speed limits. So once we have managed to reduce the speed limits, from our report on speed management that I mentioned, we have data showing that between 35 and 75% of drivers are not complying with the speed limits on urban roads. Now, of course, we need a safe system. We need to manage this in a holistic way, and that's very much what ETSC is recommending. So we've got these two reports that I mentioned, one on speed and one on urban road safety, and I'll be sure to include the links to those in the chat. But is it okay? Sorry, I just heard something there. Am I all right, Ben?
No, I don't know what that was. It wasn't.
Oh, okay. So what I wanted to say after that little preface is that ETSC is also very much encouraging cities to be leaders. Earlier this year, we were very pleased to hear that two cities, European cities, so Helsinki and Oslo, two European capitals, have achieved a real milestone. So they had 0 pedestrian and cyclist deaths in 2019, and that's a real testament to Vision Zero. of course, UTSC was one of the first in line to try to understand, how did they do this and what can we learn from their experience. Well, we had Oslo come and present at one of our webinars a few weeks ago, and they are implementing a lot of the measures that Blair mentioned also in his introductory presentation. So they have put in place lower speed limits. It's been a very long haul, and just thinking about what Robin was saying about the different steps is definitely something which takes a long time. They've improved infrastructure, focusing in on high-risk sites. They've also improved infrastructure for pedestrians and for cyclists. They've been working to reduce car traffic, and they've also introduced so-called heart zones around schools to improve safety. So Oslo has done a fantastic job. Helsinki as well. Helsinki was also working on reducing 30K, so introducing 30K zones, also working on reducing speeds in residential areas. And both of the cities have been working with traffic law enforcement. So that's another very important part of managing speed. So that was earlier this year. I mentioned Brussels in my introduction. So here in Brussels, we'll be introducing 30K across the vast majority of streets from January. So that's just around the corner. And Brussels has been working very hard to prepare for this. In the middle of this, we have the COVID crisis. And one of the things which Brussels City, so we have a regional structure in Belgium with federal levels. Brussels region has also invested a lot in increasing the capacity for cycling and walking infrastructure. So we've got new bike lanes in large pedestrian areas. All of these are very helpful in terms of preparing for the introduction of the 30K zones, but also it was part of its approach to managing COVID and making up for people's fear of taking public transport and spreading the use of public transport at peak times. Oh, sorry, my phone. We've got Brussels, now Paris. So that's a really interesting new development as well. Paris announced just last week that they're going to be consulting on introducing 30K across all of their streets, well, apart from the main arteries, so same as Brussels. And maybe the last city example, it's Bilbao. So that's a city that has said that they would do 30K everywhere. So that's quite interesting. And perhaps also in the discussion, we can talk a little bit about the importance of how you support the introduction of 30K zones with infrastructure, with enforcement. Coming back to the EU level, so the EU itself doesn't have the competence to introduce 30K zones, but it can encourage and recommend. So the EC at the moment is preparing a recommendation, and that will hopefully, fingers crossed, also include encouragement to national level authorities to facilitate 30K zones, lower speed zones in urban areas, to encourage the cities as well. And then an area where the EU does have competence, and I saw, I don't speak Spanish or not very well, but I did see there was a question about technology. So the EU also does have competence on vehicle safety technology. and has just introduced new legislation to improve the safety of cars and trucks. And for cars, there will be the introduction of intelligent speed assistance. So we're hoping that this will also help to bring down that number that I mentioned at the beginning, the non-compliance with the legal speed limit. So I've mentioned vehicle, I've mentioned infrastructure. The last one maybe is at an EU level on enforcement. So enforcement is also an area where the EU does have legislation, but more to do with following up speeding offences of people who are crossing borders. But there is also a recommendation on how to introduce and keep up good practice enforcement on speed, alcohol, and seatbelts. So we do have an EC recommendation for the member states, which also covers some of the points that Blair was mentioning at the end there. For example, how important it is to have a good follow-up. You know, one thing is putting in safety cameras. Another thing is actually having the capacity to send out the tickets and follow up with the offenders, with the whole idea that you're trying to prevent them from speeding in the first place. Perhaps the very last word. So Robin was talking about the importance of data. We do collect data, but of course we are still the non-governmental organization. And from next year, the EU will have a new system of key performance indicators where member states will be asked to send in data on speeding. That will also be very helpful, I think, in helping to direct the work on speed management at a national level as well. Okay, thanks. Sorry about the phone ringing.
No problem. No, I mean, there's lots of things going on in the EU with speed, so it's great to hear all of those perspectives. Let's move over to Iman Abubakar. Iman, you've been working with officials in Addis Ababa to change the speed limits on city roads, which they've done. And also, I'm curious to hear your perspective on how that went, but also is the city implementing sort of infrastructure changes to go along with that when, say, enforcement is somewhat more of a challenge in the built environment of a place like Addis? So Iman, please, let's hear your experience.
Thank you, Ben. That's right. Addis Ababa in 2017, through the Addis Ababa Road Safety Strategy, sort of looked at all the traffic limits within the city and did a citywide change. So urban roads speeds were reduced to 15 kilometers per hour. And then sub-arterial roads or minor arterial roads was reduced to 40 kilometers per hour. And on special zones or where there was high pedestrian activity, they reduced speeds to 30 kilometers per hour. Now, this was done at a citywide scale and done under a very short time. But I think the reason it was effective and the reason that that it worked really well was because it was data driven. So they really looked at crash-prone areas and sort of identified where the speeds were high and looked at mass transit, looked at pedestrian activity, and then sort of did this very integrated approach. In terms of speed reduction infrastructure, the city did put or installed speed humps and rumble strips at 10 crash-prone areas in the city, which really worked well, and we saw speeds reduced by about 8% citywide when this happened. And I think the integrated approach of having revision of speed limits, and then they did the enforcement, and then they sort of packaged that with like campaign or around speeding and the speed reduction interventions or infrastructure. So this whole integrated and holistic approach really helped reduce speeds in the city. Now, to the point that you mentioned about enforcement, I think they're now reconsidering and looking at that, because we have now seen speeds, at least speeding, increase by 5% since last year, due to the fact that our enforcement is really police with speed guns, and when their weather conditions are bad, or when there isn't enough police on the road, the enforcement is sort of not consistent, and that has led to a speeding increasing in certain parts of Addis. And now there is a strong focus on looking at speed cameras, on introducing technology for the enforcement purposes of that, and really also scaling the infrastructure work that's being implemented in those 10 areas, but to look at citywide level. And I think the focus now is really looking at schools. Schools are becoming a very strong entry point, and has gotten a lot of at least public approval or interest to reduce speeds to 30 kilometers per hour and lower in certain locations. And so the city is looking at now implementing speed humps and speed reduction interventions at all school areas together with enforcement. So there's a lot of work in the pipeline, but I think challenges around enforcement, around penalties being very low. I think in the region at least, people don't mind. There's no, it's a very small amount that you have to pay if you're caught speeding. People are not really, there are talks about, taking this really to the national level and increasing the penalty on speeding, and even looking at, if there's multiple speeding offenses or any, drink driving and other things, to really look at higher penalties, but also penalizing drivers so that maybe they would have to renew their license or they wouldn't be able to drive. So really looking at making that more stricter. And I think the last point has really been around the challenges around land use. And at least it's difficult because you have a lot of pedestrian activities, but you have these 4-lane roads that sort of cross through these very busy areas in cities. And so it's very difficult when you have, you could, even if you put it at 50 kilometers per hour because it's an arterial road, when you really look at the land use and the pedestrian activity, there's a need to even reduce it lower and maybe even look at more changes, not just installing speed humps, but really looking at the entire design to improve it so that speeds reflect sort of what sort of pedestrian activities happening in the area.
Thank you, Iman, and I appreciate your comment on the land use issues. I see we had a question on that, so maybe we'll get to more of that. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, and I'm just going to look at some of the questions we've had asked. One is about the culture and the acceptance of reducing speeds and people's understanding of that, and really accepting a more accepting traffic safety culture, I think. So I'd be curious to hear some thoughts on that. Another question is on the changes in land use along road segments. How do you address that? I know, for example, in the Netherlands, under this sustainable safety, there's been a large effort in the Netherlands to reclassify all roads so that they match the corresponding land use. But also that might mean changing road classification to then change the actual road use to match the land use classification. And so I'd be curious to hear some folks' thoughts on that. And then there is a question on speed cameras as well, how people might deal with cars, say, seeing one speed camera, then they speed up after they see the speed camera and sort of know where they are. So folks might have an answer to that question. But why don't, and then there's another question on emergency service vehicles and what in Brazil, for example, one of the questioners said, we've had questions about, well, how do we deal with the level of service to get emergency service vehicles through like firefighters and ambulances? Robin, why don't I start with you on sort of the approach Minneapolis has taken in its engaging with the public. I think you had an outreach effort around the Vision Zero plan you did that generated a lot of activity. I mean, was that helpful to gaining the public support, or at least showing that you do have the support of the public? Be curious to understand some of those or answers to other questions that people have posed.
I'm going to stay on this question because we've spent a lot of time, really as much time as we spent on data collection and analysis and lobby, we have spent on education and building a movement. I'm gonna call it that. And that started with the adoption, the engagement around and the adoption of the Vision Zero action plan. We made the case for street safety. Someone's child, someone's brother, someone's mother. We made the case for more equitable streets when our data showed that there were disproportionate impacts on people of color and Native Americans. We made our case for Vision Zero and safer streets. Then we made another push that really sort of cemented the movement. And that is this 20 is Plenty campaign. When we did we adopted the Vision Zero action plan, which has a number of strategies, one of which is reducing speeds. And when we were granted the authority to reduce the speed limit, we began a second and very robust push on community engagement around slower speeds. And I'm always amazed at the staff that we have in Minneapolis and how dedicated they are and how smart they are, and how a few of them are especially connected to the advocacy world. And we drew upon that for our strategies. So we started a 20 is Plenty campaign. We distributed lawn signs. We've never done that as a city, our own lawn signs. They are all over the city. I was out on a walk this morning in my own neighborhood and they are everywhere, the 20 is Plenty signs. Very visible, and it's catching on. We ran out. We don't have any more. We might make some more, but we ran out. So having a very visible place for people to reflect their own values about how they feel about the street, in their yard, in their apartment window, has been a really good strategy. There are naysayers everywhere. People who want to, who feel entitled to their car. Yes, we still have drivers. And we were able to make the case that yes, you are entitled to drive and you may need to drive, but that doesn't mean you are entitled to drive as fast as you want. So one way that we kind of shifted the conversation is by talking about signal timing. We're able to demonstrate that it may not take you any longer if you're traveling at 25 miles an hour, but the signals are timed well. And we were able to convince not everyone, but a few of the most vocal, that made sense to them. And so as part of our implementation of slower speeds, we also have a heavy lift, and we're going through it right now on signal retiming, because it may not actually take you longer if we're really smart about our signals. And that went a long way for people. So it was kind of a second strategy. We drew upon the people that wanted to be part of this movement. And then we also made a pretty cogent argument to folks who wanted to oppose it. And I think there is pretty good support for this effort now.
Actually, that's great because it brings back the real experience in Minneapolis to what Blair was talking about. We're reducing speed doesn't mean reducing travel time per se.
Doesn't need to.
Yeah.
It might, but it doesn't always need to.
Right. And so, and I want to get to kind of Ellen, there was one question, why 30 kilometers per hour? Why not 40? Why not 50? Why is it 30? I mean, how can we explain this not only to the public, but to the system designers, the practitioners that are the engineers and so forth that need to know why 30 is important, or when 50 is appropriate?
I think for 30, and why not 40 or 50? We go back to the slide that Blair had at the beginning with the power model. We have another slide which shows the difference between a death and a serious injury and survival of a pedestrian in a collision with a motorized vehicle. And that's why we advocate for 30. And of course, 30 together with infrastructure to support it through traffic calming, traffic law enforcement, and yes, also all the communication, the groundwork that Robin was just explaining. Well, congratulations, that's really amazing what you were saying about your campaign there. But then also, yeah, then you mentioned the sustainable safety approach. So there are, at a national level, that can also help. Of course, I understand that most of the participants here are working at a city level, but at a city level, of course, you can also do this, which is to undertake a speed limit review, look at the existing design of your roads, and see whether or not the speed signs that are on them are appropriate, and if not, either change the infrastructure or change the speed limit. So at a national level, Sweden, I think, who was leading with this, but in our report, we cite a couple of other national examples. So Ireland also did a big speed limit review. And now we're going to have, again, just a recommendation, but an European working group to try to promote this as an idea to all national levels within the European Union, so that all countries do a review of their speed limits. And in Sweden, in some cases, they actually increased the speed limits, but on the whole, they were reducing them or making the infrastructure change. So I think that's the bottom line, that you should have streets that people, the road users, can read. The street should cry out, this is a 30 zone, or no, 50 is all right, because there's separation. Voilà.
No, that's really interesting to hear about these reviews happening on the national level. Johanna, do you want to reflect on some of these issues around what you do on the national level flows down to the city level, or how you can impact that change or people's sort of attitudes toward the road safety culture?
Yes, I would like to, Ben. I think one very important thing in Latin America is actually the culture. We often hear that people think that they have the right to speed. And we are also working today a lot about in improving the coexistence between the road users, because we are observing in the streets that there is no mutual respect between all the road users. So I think these cultural or educational aspects are very, very important. Changing the culture based on mutual respect from all road users, and giving more rights to the more vulnerable users like cyclists and pedestrians, but also point out their responsibilities. And this is something we saw a lot about in the last month, because unfortunately during the pandemic, we observed an increase of cyclists' deaths. That's because of an important increase in speeding due to the lower traffic flow. So today, the vulnerable road users are demanding speed managing, are demanding lower speed levels, are demanding the speed cameras I already talked. So we are not only working today on a national level, but as well on observing very well the local realities, and for instance, implementing more than 100 emergency projects for cyclists, for pedestrians, doing important new street design, for instance, traffic calming measures. And that is a work we're doing especially with the municipalities, with the local authorities. So I think you always have to look the national requirements, but also have to work very hard together with the local authorities, and especially today, focused on the needs of the most vulnerable road users, and having them as a partner in demanding measures for speed management. So this is part of the work we're doing, and I think important point out the pandemic in this sense as an opportunity we have today to create more spaces, more secure spaces for pedestrians and cyclists, and having the community on our side on this work.
I'm hearing more again this necessary component to include the advocacy community, the pedestrians and cyclists, and maybe the urbanists. So that's really interesting to hear. Iman, do you want to talk about, you know, how is road safety culture changing in Addis? I mean, you had, it was not too long ago, there weren't hardly any traffic signals. You know, if somebody Googles Mescal Square from a few years ago, they would find this crazy coming together of vehicles with, you know, it's sort of a Wild West situation, as we might say here in the US. But how are things changing? I mean, how are people's attitudes toward it changing in Addis?
I mean, we're seeing like significant changes within the way that streets are being designed, with the way intersections are being designed, and with I think just a change in mindset on, you know, who are the most vulnerable road users, and who needs to be given priority as we design our cities. And I think the biggest change has really been in the sort of narrative and just the political commitment from our leaders and decision makers. There's been a shift on really the road safety agenda becoming a priority. And I think really the data that has been collected has really shown that, you know, with 86% of pedestrians accounting for road fatalities in Addis, that really shows that more needs to be done, and really who's actually being affected the most. So I think the flipping of the hierarchy and showing that pedestrians come first, and really that those are the majority of road users in many African cities, which we have around 55% of the population to 80% walking, really investing in infrastructure that is safe, and, you know, whether it's reducing speeds or tightening intersections, or you know, properly marking pedestrians, these few simple basic interventions has really changed how safe pedestrians feel. And I think just the radical changes that decision makers have taken, we've seen public interest and media and different sort of civil society groups really change their priority and really give a focus to the road safety work, that it's now become, you know, a national agenda where we have the Deputy Prime Minister as well as the Ministry of Transport really focusing on safe infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists. And we've had the launch of the Addis Ababa National non-motorized transport strategy, as well as the national level. So really focusing more efforts around pedestrians and cyclists. So it's really been that flipping of the hierarchy has really been institutionalized.
Great. And just, does anybody can comment on the one question we had about concerns about emergency vehicles? Anyone from our panel? Has that been something that's come up? I know in DC, we've asked that question before, but our police and fire departments have never actually asked that question. And I have gotten it a lot in terms of people asking about it as a concern in our cities that we work with globally, but nothing actualized in the real concerns. But if there are, it seems that's an issue in Brazil. Is there somebody that might comment on that quickly? Well, we'll have to, maybe that's not something that's come up, but it'd be interesting we can follow up with the folks in Brazil to see if there are some experiences we can share with you about how places have been dealing with that issue. I think we're actually close to our closing, and I just wanted to thank all of our panelists. It was super interesting. Ellen has sent across some links to reports. I know if you want to hear about more of the activities in Minneapolis, you can Google the Vision Zero plan, as well as the speed limit reductions, and read some articles about that. Johanna, I'm sure there's some things we might be able to share too about the speed limit reductions in Chile. And for those of you, Iman mentioned the Addis Ababa Road Safety Strategy. That also is available if you just simply Google Addis Ababa Road Safety Strategy, in which all of this sort of started for speed reduction in terms of linking that back to the strategy. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Claudia. Claudia, one question we got too was on the issue of motorcycles and how do you deal with speed reduction in motorcycles? And that is, I think, a difficult question to answer. I know that the team in WRI is working on some research in that space as well. And I'm not sure if there are any good answers. We need probably to get more perspective of cities that have high numbers of motorcyclists like we see in Brazil and in Colombia and so forth. But I will hand it over to you for final comments and closing remarks. But just a thank you to Robin, Johanna, Iman, Ellen, excellent remarks, and Blair for your presentation, Adriana for the intro. Claudia?
And thank you very much, Ben, for moderating this session. Really wonderful to have heard from all of you, Blair as a speaker and our wonderful panelists, and for all of you to have joined today and shown interest on speed management, a core issue for sure when we talk about our cities, how sustainable they are, how equitable they are. It's been really fascinating to hear across all our panelists the topic of equity and how, yes, some people, as Robin was saying, might have to drive a vehicle, but it doesn't need to have to do it in a speed that is unsafe for everybody else. Let's remember that we have 7.8 billion people in the world and only 1 billion vehicles. So there is a lot more people that walk and cycle and that need to use the streets, and that we as human beings are incredibly vulnerable to kinetic energy. We are not good at absorbing that speed. So we have to create our spaces safe and design and follow really all these recommendations. I think one important takeaway is that we have to work with the community. We have to work with the media. We have to provide more information and get the feedback from people. It was eye-opening to see this service that Blair showed us. Before reducing the speed, 80% of people agree on reducing it. And after the fact that the speed reduction happened, 90% agree on it. So I think there are few people that are really concerned, and we have to listen to them and we have to work with them. But I think afterwards, it really can be a win-win. Having safe speeds is good for everyone, and it will not really reduce the traffic, the travel time. It's been a pleasure to have you all today. This is the fourth webinar of a series of 6 webinars in the Vision Zero Challenge for Latin America. We will have our next one on November 19th, and it's going to be about data. We have heard today that a lot of these decisions need to be based on data. And really, we need to keep track and make adjustments. And for that, knowing what is happening, having a really important data set is key. So we will be talking about data on November 19. Please tune in, join us again. In the meantime, Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much for joining us. See you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.